I've learned about politics, at least in Vermont, that it really is about the stories and about personal relationships and about being able to talk to people generally face to face. It's just so compelling that as we work together and hear people's stories, we really can have an impact. The influence my parents had on me was to teach me how important it is to be involved in things that we're passionate about and that we care about. So my parents were very involved in reproductive rights. And again, this is back in the 1960s, 1970s. My mother was actually asked to be on the very first board of Planned Parenthood. So we're, going back a while. And they were also very involved. My parents were very involved in ADL, which is the Anti-Defamation League. So really concerned with anti-Semitism, but also racism and other types of discrimination. So it was really part of my sort of DNA, or kind of makeup in terms of being involved in causes and in issues that really meant a lot to my mother and father. Perhaps my mother had that point of view because she was a school psychologist, and so very interested in people advocating for themselves in terms of taking care of themselves, talking with each other. My father was very social equity minded because I think of his own upbringing in lower Manhattan, the east side of New York City, not being able to finish high school, and knowing how important it was to have an education and be able to thrive in the world. And things like anti-Semitism and racism and other things like that were certainly challenges and barriers to doing that. I went to it's called the junior high school and high school, all in Great Neck, and very progressive public schools. And we had what were called open classrooms. And so 5th and 6th graders together, for instance. And I remember one of my teachers having the girls together and talking about women's lib, right? That term. So, and getting involved in these causes, and just very open classroom, and where we could talk about our differences, our ideals, and advocacy. Then in high school, I had what was called a school within a school. So it was sort of an alternative high school, but within the actual high school. And there again, I had teachers that really cared about us and what we were interested in, what we wanted to do. And so very accepting. And I think that, having teachers that were so accepting really helped build my self-confidence and my moral compass, I think. An English teacher, her name is Arlette Sanders, and then the other one was Marion Grief. So Arlette was my high school English teacher, and then Marion Grief was the teacher who did the women's lib, and I actually am still in touch with them through Facebook, allowing us to take risks, giving us that trust, and giving us that freedom to pursue our intellectual curiosities. Clark is known for geography. And so and the nice thing about Clark University at the time is there weren't a whole lot of requirements for freshmen and sophomores, so I could really explore. So I took a lot of classes in women in international development, social geography, cultural geography. Looking back at it, I think the reason why I went to law school was because it was safe. It was a safe decision. And I remember my grandmother saying, like, what am I going to tell my girls? Meaning her girlfriends, right? My granddaughter's a geographer, all those kind of pressures, So some of my thinking in law school was that I really wanted to get out of the classroom as much as possible, and that I wanted to use internships to pursue my interests. So I did a internship with Planned Parenthood, and I think that was considered health law. I was able to fit these things in. I also did an internship with an attorney who was the lead plaintiff's attorney for women with Dowcon-Shields. It was an IUD that caused enormous amount of infertility and disease and death. And so my interest in women's health, reproductive rights, it was really interesting to work with him. And I knew that I was much more interested in policy as opposed to being in an office and doing a whole lot of transactional work, contracts or things like that. I would have considered myself an activist in college. Well, yeah, actually high school, college, and law school. I remember going to the Seabrook demonstrations and the anti-nuke demonstrations and the anti-nuke concerts with James Taylor, and so absolutely, I did see myself as an activist. So my husband also went to law school at Vermont Law School. We were married, and just loved Vermont, and both of us were looking for jobs. I think he landed the first job with a health department. So we moved to Waterbury Center for a year, and then we ended up buying our house here in Moortown and haven't left. I applied for a job at Legislative Council, and I was a finalist, and then Governor Keenan put a hiring freeze on. And so I was offered to work during the session for $5 an hour and staffing, though, the House and Senate Judiciary committees. And so I took it because I thought, what an incredible opportunity. And when I was at Legislative Council, I knew I wanted to get back into the building. I didn't know how. I certainly didn't think of running for office, but I love the pace of it. I love the issues. At that time, the death penalty was under consideration, whether or not to repeal the death penalty or actually allow the death penalty in Vermont. And I remember writing a speech why it was, such poor public policy. And, we were doing child support, all sorts of things at the time, many things that actually we're still working on now. Loving the State House, I wouldn't say that I said, oh, I love politics. I wasn't thinking of myself and I still don't think of myself as a politician, but I loved the policy. I loved being with the decision makers. I didn't decide to run for office. Like many women, I was asked to run for office. And so I was approached by the then Secretary of State, who asked me if I was interested in running. And she said, you're not going to win. Don't worry about it. Because I lived in Moortown, which was this little town. And I was running for a seat in Northfield, which was the big town with all the votes, in Roxbury. And, we had a mountain in between and didn't share any schools or commercial centers or anything. But I worked really hard and I won. So, and my family, my husband was very supportive. My girls were young. They held signs, they did all sorts of things for me. So helping somebody get health insurance is, or their medication. I remember there was a constituent in Northfield who he could not get approved for very important medication. And so helping him with that was, was incredibly gratifying, because I could see, I could see that was meaningful. Helping one person at a time is enormous and incredibly gratifying, but also is changing a law like the statute of limitations, eliminating the statute of limitations for sexual assault or child child sexual assault or child physical abuse. Some of the most challenging things in my job are the politics and the games that tend to go with politics. It's certainly not as bad in Vermont, but still there's partisanship and there are games, and that's hard for me because I tend to be direct. I don't like to play, hostage with the Senate's work or things like that. I like to sit down and talk about it and find the common goal and try to get there. So that's challenging. I think the difference between Vermont and the national scene in terms of politics is the relationships that we form in Vermont, and that I think we generally trust each other, and we generally recognize that regardless of party, that we're committed to making Vermont a better place, but also that just respect for really our common humanity. I do think we need more women in politics, more women in the judiciary. Well, I think women bring different issues to the table. So childcare, which we're just beginning to talk about on a national level, but that's a very important economic issue, family issue, educational issue. So I think women are more apt to talk about childcare. In Vermont, I think we have women represent about 26%. That's still small, considering that we represent 52% of the population. Because there is room for women to make a difference. It's very important for young women to get involved in politics. That's been difficult because it's not a family-friendly profession. Politics is not doesn't often pay that much, certainly in Vermont. So we don't see a lot of young women. So, and it's so important to have the voices. Our politics should be they should reflect our population. So the chair sets the agenda for the committee, picks the bills that the committee will work on, decides the witnesses. Really, it's the functioning of the committee. But I also see myself as I often talk about myself as being like a choreographer, and my committee members are my dancers. It's pulling everybody together, so we all have a role, and really helping to lift my members up, all of my members, regardless of party, so that we're all leaders. So while I am, the head leader, the chairperson, whatever, we're all leaders. Really trying to build an atmosphere of trust with my committee. I actually set the agenda, and as chair, it's really my prerogative to decide what we're going to take up, and there's some things that I will not take up. I just won't. I have a few bosses. So I have my constituents, my boss. I have the speaker of the House, and then I have my party leadership. Sometimes they're in conflict with each other. While I advocate for things, I think that's where the difference we were talking about before about activists and advocates and policymakers. I certainly cannot be, especially as a chair, I cannot be as much of a activist advocate. Yeah, yes, there is often conflict and often in compromise. We don't get what we wanted, but we do have buy-in. I find that when I get a bill out of my committee 11-0, there are 11 of us on the committee. If I can get a bill out 11-0, it'll have much more respect by the full House and eventually the other body, the Senate and the governor, than something that I get out on a 6-5 or 8-3. I mean, with that Democratic majority, I can push things out of committee if I wanted to, and I could just say to my Dems and my progressive, you need to vote for this, but then it doesn't gain the respect and people don't feel good about it. When I said free from violence and oppression, I was thinking of domestic violence, sexual violence, and gun violence. And the reason why I said those is because of my work on the Judiciary Committee and being very active in the areas of preventing. In terms of where everyone has access to justice, that's because, for instance, I've seen quite a bit in Vermont, and I think really, nationally, that it shouldn't matter your zip code. It shouldn't matter where you live. So in Vermont, we have 14 state's attorneys because of our counties. But depending upon where somebody allegedly commits a crime, they might go to jail, they might go to diversion, they might not even get charged. So we have 14 systems of justice. Unfortunately, it costs money to have access to justice. And that shouldn't be either. We're talking about the Constitution, and actually in the Vermont Constitution, Vermonters do have a constitutional right of access to justice, access to the courts. Eliminating the statute of limitations, both in civil matters and criminal matters, for sexual assault. So recognizing that victims, I think the average age is about 54 before somebody can actually begins to realize and process that they've been a victim of child sexual assault. So changing the laws so that they're not barred from court, so that they can come forward and still seek justice. A lot of work around domestic violence, from funding for forensic nurses to different programs, to looking at court orders consistency, taking practice that is practiced in the courts, but by putting it into law. Certainly in terms of domestic and sexual violence, I've been successful there. Absolutely. Also, I think in terms of access to justice, I've been successful in terms of some of my work on expungement of criminal records, and recognizing that if somebody has a criminal record, that doesn't tell us about them, about that person, and that it shouldn't go with them, for their life, especially if it's something that happened, 5-10 years ago, depending upon the crime, and that it's such an impediment to finding housing, serving in the military, student aid, things like that. Some states' attorneys have been doing clinics and helping people expunge their records, but just some. So by putting something like that in state law and ensuring that everybody has equal access is something that I'm proud of and continue to work on. Looking at the voter turnout in this last presidential election, and looking at our youth and how involved our youth are getting, and more conversations like this, and the conversations that are going on now about racism make me incredibly optimistic, because I think people are willing to do the work. They're like our own personal work, as well as the larger work, in communities, and much of that personal work it's so necessary, and I think that will lead to change, and really have a ripple effect. My mother died before I got into politics, but my father, and actually my father came and went door to door with me. So when I was campaigning, he came and he just thought it was incredible. He really enjoyed that, and actually when he was quite ill, he had one of my lawn signs in his hospital room, and I think it kept him going. And when I would visit him, he would always tell the doctors, it's my daughter, that's her. I think it went back to him, saying, you could be whatever you want, do whatever you want, and also the work ethic. He knew that I worked really hard and shared his work ethic.